That's not the screen I meant to share. Hold on. All right, can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it's on there.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so we are here to talk about residential options across the lifespan. And again, I'm Miranda Hess from Lehigh County Intellectual Disabilities.
And I'm Emily. I'm a program specialist with Northampton County. We're going to have a couple guest speakers, so we'll introduce them. Their names are listed below. So we have Janelle from Magellan, and we have James from Northampton County Mental Health. And even though they're not directly related to ODP and the residential services that we all might be familiar with, like life sharing or group homes, like, community living arrangements, we wanted to branch out and kind of also explain other options that might be available because, some of these might be age dependent and also depending, it could be from a different division as well.
So as Emily was saying, we are going to talk about a bunch of different residential options, and the various residential options must consider different factors such as age, needs, funding stream. We're going to try to share the information in chronological order. Different divisions share resources, so there may be different guidelines, and not all of the options are specific to the Office of Developmental Programs. So Emily and I and our regional collaborative really focuses on supporting people with intellectual disabilities and autism, which falls under the Office of Developmental Programs. But we're going to talk about a lot of options that are also outside of those types of services. And Emily just put on here as a reminder, an ODP waiver is the payer of last resort. So if there are other funding options available, they have to be explored first before we can consider waiver funding. And then also level of care is a factor when determining the support needs. And this is true for ODP. An individual must meet an ICFID or an ICF-ORC level of care, but there are level of care requirements in other divisions as well.
So as a brief mention, we wanted to include children, youth, and families, also known as CYF. Obviously, we hope there's never any involvement with CYF with our families, but, sometimes, their involvement is necessary. Just, huge disclaimer, we are not the experts when it comes to CYF. Normally, a child who's under 18 can have a case open with CYF, but they can also be involved with CYF until the age of 21. So just because someone becomes an adult at the age of 18 doesn't mean that CYF completely transitions out. There are specific circumstances as to why CYF would be involved, such as like a parent no longer being able to care for an individual. And if there's no other need for other supports, such as an RTF, which we're going to get into in a little bit with one of our speakers. So if there's no other supports needed and, a parent is no longer able to care for their child, CYF will be responsible for seeking placement. There's a lot of factors that go into that as well. Like I said, we are not the experts, so I don't want to spend too much time, trying to dissect that because, I think it'd be best to kind of reach out to that resource. I guess one thing that's also known is that children and youth may also partner with some of our ODP residential providers. So we have a couple providers who do, our different residential services that are funded by the waiver. However, if CYF is seeking placement, they would be the payer and it wouldn't necessarily be an ODP waiver. So that's one thing to consider as well. Also, when it comes to placement for a child, There are different guidelines that come into play. So there's the Chapter 6400, which is what the ODP residential guidelines are determined by the state. And then for children, it's under the 3800 guidelines. So those are gonna look a lot different. And then typically, I say typically because, you know, every situation is different. ODP would not fund a residential placement for a minor. But again, there have been unique situations and, you know, we always want to, you know, evaluate a person's situation depending on their support needs. Let's see here. I can take the lead, Miranda.
Okay,
Sorry.
great, thanks.
Yeah, since I was able to, you know, meet with Janelle and James. So we're gonna go in chronological order. I've included their information here below. If they have resources, we'll definitely request them and, you know, share them along with everyone who's registered for today. First, we're gonna have Janelle. She is a care manager for Magellan Behavioral Health, and she's gonna talk to us about residential treatment facilities, which is gonna be a placement for children. And then we also have James from mental health. He works specifically with housing and treatment unit. And he's going to discuss how transitional housing through, you know, the mental health division, which might be applicable since, you know, we do have a lot of individuals who are dually diagnosed. So we want to make sure that those options are explored and, you know, you guys are familiar with them. So Janelle, I believe you have a brief slideshow, correct?
I do.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay,
All
I'm gonna
right.
do a co-host and I'm gonna stop sharing so you can go ahead and share your screen.
Awesome. My disclaimer is I haven't done this before with a PowerPoint, so I'm going to hope that it all goes smoothly. Say a little prayer. All right. So as stated, my name's Janelle. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. A little bit about myself. I am a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Pennsylvania. I have been employed with Magellan for a little bit more than 4 years. Today, I've been invited to talk to the group about the residential treatment options for individuals with what we call co-occurring autism spectrum and intellectual disability diagnoses. So we're going to talk about the process in general, and then I'll try to respond to some specific questions about the specialty programs for those populations. Some general office business, I am going to use the term RTF. Residential treatment facilities. It's shorter to say and it saves a little bit on time. The information that I'm going to share is specific to Magellan and Pennsylvania, counties we service, and our provider network. There are a lot of other managed care companies in Pennsylvania that follow similar rules but have different processes. We also refer to the kids who have Magellan as an insurance as members, as well as the adults. I'll use this interchangeably with children and adolescents. And then at the end of the slide, we do have additional resources that we can provide to Miranda and Emily for distribution. And that'll cover a lot of additional information more in depth than we can do in our PowerPoint today. One second, I have to move this to get to this. Okay, so a little bit about our agenda. Magellan is a managed care organization. We're going to touch on our CASP principles, which really guide the decision-making process when it comes to any children's services. A little bit about the residential treatment as a level of care and how the level of care system works, the process for acceptance, and then a little bit about what families can expect from the RTF treatment and what Magellan expects of our providers. And then we'll have some time for some questions and answers. All right, so Magellan has been around for more than 20 years. We oversee the behavioral health benefits of 5 counties in Pennsylvania, of course, including Lehigh and Northampton, which is why we're here today. To help with this oversight, we do employ professionals from all different fields of study, including medical directors, master's levels, and bachelor level clinicians, many of whom are licensed. We also employ high school graduates with mental health experience. We, as an organization, are held accountable by many different human service divisions at the county, the state, and the federal levels. I like to highlight as a member or a parent The most frequent point of contact at Magellan is going to probably be a care manager such as myself. Many of our care managers live and work in the counties we service and have a lot of years experience in direct care. I have to highlight the mission statement for Magellan real quickly. Our goal is to support our members, whether they be children or adults, on their journey to recovery. And our big focus is on the wellness and resiliency. So the levels of care, what is the level of care? It's different depending on exactly what you're talking about. How we classify the groups of services under the behavioral health umbrella really kind of sums it up on this side. I'll show you a picture in a minute of what that looks like to help clarify. For any of our children's services, the decision-making process is guided through the CASP principles. That's the Child and Adolescent Service System Program. For me personally, that's a tongue twister. It's a defined set of 6 different principles that have these little bullet points at the core center. I think most of them are self-explanatory. I think it's important to highlight that the process is very child-centered. In that, obviously the child is at the heart of the decision-making. And it's also important to note in the mental health field in Pennsylvania that kids who are age 14 or older have a right to make their own decisions when it comes about their treatment options and what they think is best. Of course, the family guides that process. I think it's also important to highlight the multi-system approach. We believe the more people, the better when it comes to the care of the child and who's involved, because it's indicative of a wide network of support. So when we talk about multi-system, we talk about schools, we talk about other mental health professionals, we talk about community supports. All of those people we like to see invited to the table for discussion. And then the least restrictive is a theme that you'll see through the behavioral health field. We're always looking for the level of care or the treatment that is the least restrictive. We know that children, excuse me, I lost my place. We know that when it comes to the wellness of the child, they're best serviced in a place where they feel connected and cared for. And the biggest protective factors for children are their connections to home, school, and communities. And this is really at the center of our CASP principles. So on to the levels of care. This is the picture that I had referenced earlier. I like this because it's a representation of the continuum of the behavioral health services. They're not all included here. There might be a couple that are missing, but what we see here on the left side is the outpatient level of care, which is considered the least restrictive. You know, that's where you go to the office and you're there maybe an hour a week. And then we move up the continuum all the way to the extreme right, where it's hospitalization. We all have an idea of what that looks like. And I need to highlight that the residential treatment programs are one step below the hospitalization. So they are a highly restrictive level of care. They're considered a 24/7 setting, similar to the hospital. There are only a few differences between the residential treatment programs and the hospitals. And I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but if you folks have questions about that, we can talk about that some more during our question and answer time. All right, so the residential treatment services. There's a ton of information on this slide. I know one of the topics that we wanted to touch on was who is kind of age qualified for those services. There isn't really a beginning age. It's very, very unusual if we see children recommended for an RTF level of care who are elementary school age, I'll say. As we go up the longitudinal path of the development of the child, most of the kids that we see referred for this high level of care, I would say between the ages of 10 and 21. The behavioral health services in general do cover all individuals for children up to the age of 21. So the young ones, it's really, really unusual, and rightly so. So I'm going to give you guys a minute just to take a glance at this slide. It talks a little bit about just some basic eligibility, who might qualify, if the RTF's the right decision, about how they can best treat, and what we know about the length of stay. Like I said, I'll give you a minute to take a look at this, and then we'll reserve questions for our Q&A. Okay, I'm going to move forward. Some things to consider about what to expect as a caregiver. The RTF setting is a 24/7 setting with supervision and care, but it is not therapy 24/7. Most of the RTFs have an individual and family session each week. The ASD-ID programs usually have a parent training session. These sessions are focused on parent skill building while working to understand the meaning of the challenging behaviors and ways for the caregiver to respond to that behavior. Family involvement is a must. Families will be asked to participate in sessions as well as trainings. And of course, their input during meetings is vital to the success of everybody in the family. Groups do happen, group therapy, social skills groups, and some groups are offered for family support groups and different topics. When it comes to schooling, the kids go to school. That's mandatory. The schools may be on campus or in another accredited school program in the local school district, in which case they would be transported there. Therapeutic leaves is always a hot topic. That's what we call home passes. They're an integral part of the treatment, and they're expected to happen as soon as deemed safely possible. Again, pointing back to the best place for the kids to be is really in their home environment and practicing those skills that they're learning in the RTF. So we look for that hopefully within 60 days of admission. Getting into the pre-authorization process for the RTF level of care, pre-authorization is always needed. If a caregiver thinks that an RTF might be needed or it might be a good fit, it typically starts with a face-to-face psychiatric evaluation as the first order of business. If that eval by a psychiatrist results in a recommendation for the RTF, and everybody's in agreement and they're interested in pursuing the treatment, the next step would be to have what we call an interagency or CASP meeting. This can be arranged by the provider who makes the recommendation or the county mental health office. And pointing back to those CASP principles, we look to have a lot of people involved in that decision-making process, not necessarily because they make the final decisions, but because their input is really valuable to shaping the treatment needs and really understanding what the kids need. And then once the meeting takes place, if it concludes and everybody's still in agreement, the process moves forward with a packet submission to Magellan and a medical necessity review. Oh, a ton of information on this slide too. In a nutshell, once the packet arrives at Magellan, a care manager has to compare the request for treatment to the medical necessity criteria, which is a set of guidelines that are set out for us on the medical necessity. A copy, if people are interested, a copy of that information is also available on our website. Magellan also follows a lot of guidelines and best practice principles. And we really strive to ensure that the CASP principles are being followed with the requests for treatment. And again, we have to look at, is this the least restrictive setting for the child? Have other levels of care been attempted before this RTF recommendation is being made? If an individual is approved for the RTF, we move forward. The only caveat to that is if another insurance is involved, we have to use that resource first to support in finding an RTF. Magellan is known as the payer of last resort because it's the Medicaid funding. So we look at those resources. If we're the only insurance involved, a bed search begins almost immediately once a child's approved through the process. And that can be within 24 to 48 hours, or we'll start sending out referrals. And then the search ends when a member is accepted to the provider or when they no longer need that level of care. If they're not approved, because they don't meet medical necessity after a doctor review, that's called a denial. And a grievance can be filed by the member or the family on their behalf. It allows for a second look at the information and ultimately another medical necessity review. However, in the meantime, while that process is happening, another level of care will be authorized almost immediately, so that the support is still available. Right, and then lastly, I just wanted to follow with some expectations that Magellan has for the providers in our network. We use active care management procedures, and we look for indications and evidence that the provider is adhering to the highest standards for the quality of care. So some of the things that we expect is that the provider is addressing behaviors that prevent the child from making progress. We look at what's the child's behavior saying, what's the function of behavior, what helps them in times of crisis. We look for the treatment to be very strengths-based and align again with the CASP principles. We look for treatment and interventions that will be evidence-based, which means they're scientifically proven strategies with outcomes that can be measured. We also put a lot of pressure on our providers to work with families to reduce the barriers to full family involvement. We run across a lot of different situations that can be really easily resolved with a little bit of support. And we know that the family and caregiver involvement is critical to the outcomes. Of course, we have the crisis safety planning and discharge planning. It's the same process for every level of care. And my personal philosophy is that with regards to discharge planning, it really needs to start on the day of admission. And the whole thought and thinking there is, if you have an idea of what your destination is, you have a better idea on how to get there. So that really concludes the information that I wanted to present. I'm guessing that there are probably some questions. And folks are welcome to include anything in the chat or take yourself off mute.
I'm keeping an eye out on the chat if anyone has questions. But like Janelle mentioned, you can also unmute yourself. I guess also when it comes to Magellan, I know Janelle mentioned this, if your loved one has medical assistance through Lehigh or Northampton counties, Magellan would be your behavioral health provider. So that's kind of like one and one together. I guess we have one that's just wondering when the recording would be available. So normally the URL or the hyperlink becomes available the next day. So Miranda will probably forward that out once it's available. Janelle, if you could send me your PowerPoint as well, that'd be great. That way we can include everyone's information together.
Absolutely.
So by tomorrow we'll have everything, hopefully.
I'm just going to put out a plug. The Lehigh Valley Supporting Families Collaborative just recently started a YouTube channel so that we can post all of the recordings for presentations like this on that channel. So right now we only have one video on it, so we will definitely add this one to it as well. So then we'll have two. So feel free to check that out as well. I'll make sure to include that I will send out a follow-up for everybody who registered for the presentation. So you'll get that, if not tomorrow, definitely early next week.
We do have a question, Janelle. Does Magellan work with adults older than 21?
They certainly do. There's so much lingo around the insurance piece. I want to make sure that I can be clearly understood. So we have the Children's Behavioral Health Umbrella, which is some of the information that I talked about here today. But anybody who is enrolled in the Medicaid program for, again, Lehigh and Northampton counties would also be eligible in the same way as an adult. And we have a ton of adult services, whether they be for substance abuse or adult mental health, all kinds of different things.
Thank you. Any other questions? I know we have a bit of an agenda today, so I just want to make sure if anyone has questions that they ask them, but also, so for our speakers, if they need to sign off, they can, but while they're here, they can be a resource. So.
Hi, Janelle. I have a question for the young adults older than 21. What is the best way to start the process for services for, say, behavioral health through Magellan?
That's a great question. What you're going to do is they would have to apply at the county assistance office and complete the application for the Medicaid.
Yeah, he has Medicaid already.
Okay. Then yeah, you know what? I have to get some more clarity on exactly how that works with the adult system.
Okay.
So maybe what we can do for you guys is connect you directly to a Magellan care manager that works with adults. So if you have specific questions about, what he might be eligible for, then you can certainly get those questions answered. We had actually done a presentation a while back on Magellan services. So I will see if I can dig up that presentation also, if individuals have more questions about Magellan.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. I just want to confirm, is that Matt and Judy?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Hi.
Any other questions for Janelle while she's here? Okay, I'll take the silence maybe as a no, or maybe people are still developing some questions. If you guys have questions and Janelle's no longer connected, you can forward them to Miranda or myself, and we can get you connected to Janelle as well. So, Janelle, I just want to say thank you for your time. If there are no questions, I don't want to hold you up since, this was just a portion, of the presentation. But if you can, like I said, forward your contents to me. We'll be sure to distribute with everyone.
Sure, absolutely. If it's all right, I'll hang out for a little while.
Hey, okay, even better.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, so up next, we have James from Northampton County Mental Health. He's going to discuss a little bit about transitional housing available through mental health and what that looks like.
Okay, I also have a slide presentation. So if I can get access.
As a co-host?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I did add you as a co-host, so you should be able to share.
Okay. I don't see it. Oh, I see it. There we go. This is also my first time doing this, so bear with me. So thank you for having me tonight, and hopefully I can give some clarity around the mental health housing within Northampton County. So my name is James Strauss, and I am the caseworker supervisor for the housing and treatment unit here at Northampton County. So I oversee all the residential programs that Northampton County offers to all Northampton County residents. So within our system, we have, again, we talk about level of care within behavioral health all the time. So even in our residential system, we look at level of care. So we offer different levels of care within our community residents. We offer 24 hours supervised, 16 hours, and then we also have transitional independent living apartments. Now, all these residential programs are transitional programs with the expectation that individual can live independently in the community with community supports in place. So meaning that our expectation is that the consumers within our residential programs are moving forward to gaining independent living situations, such as going into HUD subsidized apartments with other services in place. So I'm just going to go through some of the general ideas or structures of our supervised homes. So our 24-hour supervised CRR level homes, they are staffed 7 days a week. They're kind of similar to the CLAs in ODP programs, but there are some big differences. One difference is the staffing ratio. In the state of Pennsylvania, our providers only have to provide 1 staff per shift for all the residents. So we here in Northampton County actually have 2 24-hour community CRR level homes that the community I can accept community referrals into. One is an 8-bed resident and one's 11-bed resident. So kind of give you an idea that individuals in these homes have to have many independent skills to be able to be successful in these types of programs. These programs work on mental health recovery, medication management. Here, they do not administer medications, they only monitor medications. They work on health and wellness goals, activities of daily living, which are like cooking, budgeting, household cleaning. And all the residents work on goals to move to more independence or move down within our levels of care. Our next level is the 16-hour supervised apartments. And again, these are only staffed 16 hours of waking hours. And it's actually several apartments, and then staff kind of float through the apartments. And again, we kind of look at the same mental health recovery, medication management, health and wellness activities, daily activities of daily living also within this program. And then we go to our least restrictive, which is our transitional supportive independent living. So here we have 2. One, some of you might have heard of the Lodge, which is based out of the south side of Bethlehem. And then we also have a program that we call 13th Street, which is actually based in Easton. Both of these programs, individuals have to be pretty independent. So that means they have to be able to take their medications. Everybody has to be involved in mental health treatment. And they all have to be on a housing waiting list or applying to a housing wait list once it's open. So these programs are really designed for someone that is really needs just a little extra support while moving into their own independent living situation, and which is permanent. So within our housing program, we have certain criteria, and these are just some of the general criteria that we kind of look at in housing. So first off, for Northampton County, someone has to meet residency. And we look at residency as someone physically sleeping in the county for the last 30 days. So we don't necessarily take someone's medical assistance because our population is very transient. So some of our individuals will move to Lehigh County and not change their assistance when they're supposed to, and then move back. So we kind of look at where the person physically lives within the county boundaries. We also have very specific diagnosis that we look at, and that are our primary diagnosis that we work with individuals. And these are individuals that suffer from schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, psychotic disorders, and such. So those are the primary diagnoses for individuals that we serve. Everyone must be engaged in mental health treatment. They cannot be using drugs or alcohol. We look at income. All of our residents require income of some sorts. And one exclusion criteria is that someone cannot have a history of fire setting. And they also have to be able to complete self-care. That means bathing themselves, clothing themselves. None of our providers can provide hand-on assistance to anyone, such as bathing, clothing, etc. So when someone is referred, so generally the referral process, we typically get referrals for our program, come from the hospitals, ACT teams, which are assertive community teams, ICM, BCM, which is intensive case management, behavioral case management, and other community agencies send us referrals. They would first call information and referral. I list the number here, which I will definitely share my presentation. That would be one way to start a referral, or at least look into to see if someone is eligible for our residential programs. And after that, a provider would complete a housing referral and send a current psychiatric evaluation both to the provider that's going to be receiving the referral and us at Northampton County Mental Health. So both parties get the same information. And the psychiatric evaluation is actually a state regulation for our residential programs. So I've also listed some other resources. So I listed all the housing authorities, Allentown, Bethlehem Housing Authority, which their list was just opened last week. Unfortunately, now it's closed. So sometimes you have to, the housing authorities only open lists at a short amount of time. Easton Housing Authority, Lehigh County, and Northampton County, the housing authorities. Usually, you know, for our folks, the primary diagnosis is always a mental health diagnosis. We can accept some individuals that have intellectual disabilities, but we usually require them to go through the waiver process first, due to our programs are very limited. And it's all transitional based that, you know, individuals are to move into their own independent permanent housing. And I think that's it. So I will take any questions.
I just wanted to throw out there too, I know that it was mostly Northampton County services that were discussed, but the Lehigh County mental health housing options are very similar. There might be, some differences with regards to locations and different types of options, but the process is pretty similar, and most of the services are very similar.
Yes, that is correct. We usually, between Lehigh County and our services, they're very similar. Each one county has some differences in services, but they're pretty much the same across the board.
Hi, this is Judy. I just have a question. So are these services just for clients that have mental health issues? Or do those clients that have autism spectrum disorder fall under that somewhere also?
We,
In Lehigh County, basically, I guess. I don't know if you could answer that question. Maybe that's more for Miranda.
I couldn't answer for Lehigh County. I can answer for Northampton County. We definitely, we look at cases on an individual basis. Our providers aren't trained or set up a lot of times to handle some of the behaviors that might be associated for some individuals. So we have to be very selective as
Right.
to who comes into the program. And also individuals have to be well enough in order to gain independence.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you.
I also wanted to mention the reason why I thought James would be a good resource is specifically for our autism only population. I mean, they do have to meet the mental health requirements, so there probably could be like a dual diagnosis of sorts. But as James mentioned too, it's like the person-centered focus as well, depending on an individual's support needs. But when it came to transitional housing, I know ODP has a few, like independent living situations. So I thought, having that transitional piece through mental health, if applicable, could be a resource for our individuals as well.
And we do currently have individuals that have the diagnosis of autism or, autism spectrum disorder that are currently in our housing programs. So it's not that it, so those individuals, we look at everybody individually. So if we can support someone, we will. We tend to look at, they should have some failed attempts at independent living. Because again, our housing programs are not a permanent housing program. All of our housing is transitional. So we have to be very careful, and we have limited availability within the system itself. So it can make it challenging.
Any other questions for James while he's here? You can put them in the chat or unmute yourself. If not, you can always email us with questions and we'll redirect them accordingly. Okay. I think you're good, James. I appreciate your
All right.
time and sharing the resource. And I think also too, having someone, with autism that you're serving just kind of puts it into perspective that, there are other options available as well, depending on, the eligibility and also the ability to serve them. So thanks.
Yeah. And just to kind of give an idea, we do, currently we have an individual at the lodge. So our less restrictive environment, most independent.
That's
They're
awesome.
working, so, so to kind of give you an idea that we do serve on all spectrums.
We love
Yeah.
to see it. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, if you can, no rush. If you want to send me your PowerPoint, I'll make sure everything gets, put together for everyone. Okay. Well,
All
with
right.
that, I think we're good to go back onto ODP, residential services. So Marin, if you want to pop in the slideshow again.
All right. All right. Can everybody see that? I'm good, right?
Yes, you're
Okay.
good.
All right, so jumping into ODP funded residential services. So just to a kind of disclaimer, not all of these are necessarily specifically residential, but these are all of the services that kind of help people to live more independently. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. So we're going to talk about housing transition and tenancy sustaining services, remote supports, supported living, life sharing, and residential habilitation. So I think when people think about waiver funded residential services, most people have heard of group homes. That's essentially what residential habilitation is. But there's a lot of other ways that individuals can be supported residentially through IDA waivers as well. So we wanted to make sure that everyone is familiar with some of these other options that are out there.
Okay, so the first service we have here, once we send out the PowerPoint, I went a little crazy with the links, but you'll be able to go to the ISP manual, and I highlighted what page every service is on. So we did a presentation, well, we had a speaker present on the housing transition and tenancy services a few months ago. But this service would be ideal for someone who, I guess, is interested in living independently so that they're not necessarily living with family or with a residential provider. So as the name of the service says, it's just kind of transitioning into housing, but then also remaining in that placement. So services that include is kind of like tenant screening, a housing assessment, a support plan, support crisis plan, and then maintaining tenancy. So there's like a specialist. There are a couple of providers who do this service, and we do have a couple individuals who do receive this service. So what the specialist does, they help the individual with finding housing, what that application process would look like, kind of do like a full map of what resources they have in order to cover all the expenses, assist with coordinating the moving, securing furnishings, and just kind of going through training and education as to what it means to be a good tenant, what responsibilities are also associated with being a tenant. And it has to be integrated in the community. So what that means is like, it's not that you can have, one apartment complex where all of the individuals, that we serve are in one placement. We want to make sure that they're, they are part of society and, that they're able to kind of have this, option for them. There is a limit to the service, which is 160 hours per year. So that would be within the parameters for each fiscal year, but there's not necessarily like an end date. So if let's say the person continues to live in an apartment setting where they have this service, that specialist can remain with them in order to kind of, go through, preventing eviction, renewing a lease. If they wanted to move, what would that look like? So the one limitation also listed on here is that it may not be authorized for individuals residing and remaining in residential placement. So if an individual is already in residential and they plan on staying in residential placement, such as life sharing or a group home, the community living arrangement option, they can't necessarily receive this service. However, there is the exception that if the individual is in residential habilitation and they want to move into independent living, they can pursue this service. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. But from my experience with the individuals who do receive this service, they do report to be successful because it kind of is a learning experience for the individual as well. So it provides kind of like an all-encompassing path when it comes to like looking for an apartment or even a house if they wanted to purchase too. I
So
have a,
do you have oh, okay, you see the question?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great.
Yeah, so at what age does the housing transition and tenancy services start? 18 or 21, or is a waiver needed? So this is a waiver funded service through ODP. So the individual would have to have a PFDS, CLW, or consolidated waiver. But the conversation for transition always begins a little bit earlier than that. It's always a good conversation to have with your team as to what housing placement of an individual can have throughout their lifespan. So I think it's always going to be an ongoing conversation. However, this service specifically is waiver funded. So the individual would have to have a waiver. Any other questions related to housing transition and tenancy services? I know this might be more applicable for our individuals who are capable of independent living. So it could always be a valuable resource, but if there are any questions, just put them in the chat and we'll come back to them, so we can keep going and reviewing other options.
So remote supports, this is another service that is probably for people who have some level of independence, not necessarily somebody who would need 24 hours a day of supervision. So remote supports, it's a newer service to assist with obtaining and maintaining independence within their private home. So again, this would be for an independent living type of setting where an individual has their own apartment or even their own home. And it's for when direct services are not needed. So when they don't need a live person in the home with them, they could use remote supports instead. It involves the use of technology that uses two-way real communication. So that's one of the components of it. Has to be able to be two-way real communication with another live person on the other side. There are awake staff from an agency who are off-site. They monitor the remote supports, they respond to health and safety needs, they interact as needed. So it's not something where they're, talking the individual through 24 hours of their day of tasks, but if there's certain periods that are identified where the individual needs support, that staff would be there available to talk them through something, whether it's something maybe like med management, or, we have individuals who maybe need to check their blood sugars daily or things like that, and they just need a little bit of support, somebody to walk them through it. They would be able to potentially use remote supports for something like that. Recording of the participant, either audio or video, is prohibited, and there cannot be any monitoring completed in bedroom or bathroom areas for the individual's confidentiality. If audio is needed, the participant must be alerted prior to the activation. So for example, if a participant's in the bedroom or bathroom and the staff on the other end need to communicate with them while they're in the bedroom or the bathroom, they would need to be notified first before they can turn on that two-way communication. There are other types of technology. I just want to throw this out there. It's not included on the slide, but there's other types of technology that can also be implemented for people who maybe need some assistance, but maybe don't need the two-way real-time communication. So for example, an individual could have something like a stove shut off installed so that, if their stove is on for a certain amount of time, it would automatically shut off. We have individuals that have things like bed shakers to help them wake up for work, if they have a really hard time responding to a traditional alarm clock. We have things like med boxes that distribute a single dose of meds at a time. They can be programmed to dispense all of the 8 a.m. meds at 8 a.m. every day. So it's basically preloaded and dispenses the meds at the time that they need them. So there's a lot of different types of technology out there to help people to live more independently, to be able to reduce the reliance on staff or other natural supports that they might otherwise need to do some of these tasks on their own. Any questions about remote supports or the use of technology?
I think this one might be a two-parter. I think there's a second slide for this one.
Is there? Oh, okay.
I think so.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah. So I guess just some some background information on how this support is kind of completed. Also, in addition to the technology piece and the video and audio recording being prohibited, the individual also has to have the ability to, or natural support should be able to unplug it or disconnect it if they choose to. So that's also one of the guidelines for the service as well. The provider is responsible for training, delivery, installation, and the monitoring of the equipment and technology. So any type of piece of technology that is needed for this service has to be provided by the provider, and making sure that it's like up to date. However, one of the aspects that the provider is not responsible for is for the expense of internet. Because sometimes there might be someone, if it's like that requires an internet connection, the internet already has to be available within the home, and the provider is not responsible for that expense, only because there could be other uses for the internet. So that's why the provider would not be responsible for that expense. I included an example of a more popular option, which is Safe and Home. I know that was my first exposure to remote supports a few years ago. So once we share the presentation, you can use the link and, be able to, kind of explore and kind of get to learn more about this support. And same as before, when it comes to the housing tenancy, this service cannot be authorized as a separate service for individuals receiving supported living, life sharing, or residential habilitation. So those are the direct residential services. And another limitation when it comes to remote supports is that the direct provision of CPS, which is community participation support, shall not be rendered on the same days and times that remote supports are rendered. It's basically to prevent like a duplication of service. So this could be, really good for individuals who can, live independently and just kind of need a little extra something that may not be needed for like a staff who needs to be there for a couple hours at a time. So this could be more as needed for the individuals who could benefit from it.
Okay,
Okay.
now are there any questions about remote support?
Maybe not, but I'm sure they'll come.
Yeah, so supported living is basically the lowest level of residential services that are offered by a traditional provider agency. So supported living, this is, kind of the clinical definition: direct and indirect services provided to participants who live in a private home owned, leased, or rented by the individual, or provided for use via special needs trust. So basically what that means is the individual would need to live in their own private setting. So a home that they rent or own. But the service is what it means by direct and indirect service. It means that it can provide staffing in their home directly to them, a one-to-one face-to-face service. But then there's also this kind of indirect component where, if they need something when they don't have scheduled staff, they can call. There's, an on-call component. The supported living provider can also implement some use of technology to help support the person in their apartment. It is overseen by a supported living specialist, and it can assist with protecting the health and welfare, self-care, health maintenance, meal prep, home management, mobility and transportation, participating in community functions, and so much more than that. This is a service that's billed as a day unit. So that basically just means that it is kind of a bundled service. So there's a lot of other things that are included in supported living. Those other services that we were talking about, the housing transition and the remote supports, they are, I'm going to say, more piecemealed services. They're considered discrete services, which means that you can kind of build in exactly what you need for the individual, picking different types of services. Supported living is a bundled service, which just means that if they need some help with communicating with their landlord, supported living would assist with that. So they wouldn't need that separate housing transition and tenancy sustaining service. The supported living specialist would play that role for somebody in supported living. It is available to individuals only who have a community living waiver or a consolidated waiver. And if they are receiving supported living, the individual cannot receive discreetly authorized remote supports, other residential services, homemaker chore, respite, specialized supplies, in-home and community supports, consultative nutritional services, behavior supports, therapy, shift nursing, and communication specialist. Again, because those are things that would all be considered to be a component of that supported living service. How do you determine if a person is eligible for supported living? So that's a hard question. So really, it would be somebody who does not need 24 hours a day of supports. So the supported living service really does not cover 24 hours a day of staffing. So it would be somebody who can live mostly independently, but does need some supports either on a daily or almost daily basis. And typically would need supports that are beyond what could be provided through like in-home and community supports or remote supports on their own or that kind of thing. Just as an example, we have a gentleman from Lehigh County who owns his own home. His family purchased it for him before they passed away. The gentleman is now in his 50s. So the home is maintained by a trust. So he owns his own home, which he lives in. He did have some in-home and community supports. I think he had about 30 hours a week of in-home and community supports, and that was helping with his activities of daily living. But they found that he was really calling his staff a lot after hours. Like, they would work with him for a couple hours during the day to get his grocery shopping done, help him cook, help him with his laundry, those types of things. But he was calling a lot in the evening, if he had a question or sometimes just if he was lonely. And it really made more sense to enroll him in supported living instead, because just how it's billed and that supported living can also provide that indirect service as well. So, if he had a question after hours or, even just if he needed something at night when there wasn't staff scheduled to come, he could call, and the supported living, because it's a day rate service, they would be able to come out and assist him on a more as needed basis. I hope that answered that question.
That's good.
Okay.
Okay, so our next residential service, so we're kind of moving, as Miranda mentioned, from like least restrictive to most restrictive. And it's not going to be as restrictive as like, complete, locked facilities or anything like that. So, but the next service that we have here is life sharing. As I mentioned, the link will be available once we send out the presentation. So life sharing, I know there's a lot of questions when it comes to this service. So it's kind of trying to figure out what it is. So it's a residential service managed by a provider agency taking place in a private home of a host family or a life share. So I guess to break that down a little bit more, that would be if I were to if I go to a provider agency that's qualified to do life sharing and I'm like, hey, I want my home to be a life sharing home, I could then bring in an individual in order to live with me and my family in my home. It could be provided by a relative as well. So I know that's also an option. So I think this is a really good option for individuals who would want, who thrive off that family setting. Because, the goal is to always, have that family inclusion, that component. I know as parents get older, they question or wonder, what's going to happen with my loved one when I'm no longer able to care for them. But let's say they do really well in that family setting and maybe a group home is not the most appropriate option or it's more restricted than what they need, then life sharing should be considered. It provides that host family component. It also promotes the shared daily life experience. So just kind of going through the day-to-day of like an everyday household. It's kind of want to say it kind of accurately describes like the everyday lives principles, because an individual will have that everyday life. The host family would be responsible for providing care and support to the individual. So it would be like going to doctor's appointments, getting out into the community, maintaining life skills, providing transportation where needed, socialization, Another component would be related for the individuals to continue having their routines, their privacy, rights, personalization, and independence. And the life sharing home would obviously be the primary residence of the individual. When I was a supports coordinator, I had I had a couple individuals in a house. It was a family, and they had individuals through life sharing. And, they were able to have, rooms decorated to their taste. Their needs were being met through this family. They ended up being in that placement for 10 plus years until the individual passed. But it was a really nice setting where a family was able to bring people into their home and give them that home environment. So it can be very successful. Obviously, it's also nerve-wracking, sending an individual with another family. However, if you have a waiver and you're looking at residential options, we want to make sure that life sharing is always considered as well. So there's a question in the chat quickly. How does a provider play in this equation? So the provider would kind of manage, there's like licensing and things like that, qualifications to making sure that the house meets the state's guidelines in that sense. So when it comes to more so for licensing. So, and they also do like general oversight with documentation, making sure things are running smoothly. I've seen in the past where the life sharing agency also oversees like some of the medical stuff, depending on how, what those needs are like. I guess also too, now that if people are asking questions related to life sharing, one of the conversations we were having as a committee is to have a standalone life sharing presentation. I do have a colleague who's worked in the field specifically with life sharing for quite some time. So I think they would be able to provide more insight. We were also thinking maybe bringing in as well a life share or that host family component, so that they can kind of speak to their experience. So that way, if families have questions, they can ask them. Because we just want to do like a general overview today. So that you guys can be aware of that service. But if we want more details, we can always share those and kind of coordinate a presentation for that. Another question that we have, if the life sharing caregivers work during the day, can the participants go to a day program during the day? Yes. So as long as, the individual has like the funding for both life sharing and community participation supports, that can be an option as well. It's really common. I've seen it done before. So CPS is an option. Another question is, can they receive home and community HAB services or nursing services within the life share? So if they are in life sharing, they cannot receive those services. There is a request that can be made if there is a need for supplemental habilitation. So that would have to be approved, but that is also for temporary measures. So it wouldn't necessarily be permanent or long-term. So the one-on-one for community HAB or nursing services has to be entered within 90-day intervals, and beyond the 90 days would require a variance form and further approval by the state. Again, because there has to be that transition out, for it to kind of basically phase out. So it wouldn't be a permanent arrangement there.
So I do just want to talk a little bit about the nursing services in life sharing. So a life sharing agency, sorry, I just messed up my slides. A life sharing agency is responsible to meet the individual's needs who's in life sharing. So if a person requires nursing, it would be the life sharing agency's responsibility to provide that nursing service. So they can receive nursing, but not as a discreetly authorized service through their waiver. The life sharing rates in themselves are not significant enough to cover a nursing service typically, but there is an opportunity to request a higher rate from the state if there's a person in life sharing who requires nursing. We don't see that really happen very often. Just most people who require that nursing level of care. It's hard to find life sharing families who have the skills or the comfort to be able to take those people into their homes. So we don't see that very often, but it is a possibility. I don't want to discount it as a possibility.
There's also the initiative too for the medically complex. So there is a designation through ODP. If it's not intellectual disability or autism, we do have a medical complexity that someone can be registered under. And I know that the state is trying to focus on life sharing and getting those homes qualified in order to provide care for those more medically complex individuals. So I'm not sure if that necessarily answers your question. I know it's relatively new, so it might take some time for it to kind of really be established. But I know that the state wants to kind of promote that setting so that there's not so much hospitalizations or people being in long-term care facilities so that they can live in the community. I guess and that answered one question that was in the chat, so it would
Yeah, so
not
we
be
have, the
appropriate.
next is, how does an individual get rehomed in life sharing if
Yeah.
the host family can no longer take care of them? So that's where the provider agency is really instrumental. So if the host family can no longer take care of them, and we see a lot of situations, you know, sometimes it's personal issues within the family, sometimes they are moving out of state, you know, there's a lot of reasons why a family may no longer be able to care for somebody. The agency will really get involved with identifying a new family that would be a good fit for the individual, that would be able to meet their needs. If the agency really cannot support that individual anymore because they just, you know, can't find an appropriate family, then the supports coordinator would make referrals to other life sharing agencies to look for a family that would be able to meet that person's needs.
And also too, when it comes to like rehoming or even just finding a placement as well, you know, being able to meet the families beforehand is always an option. So you can always request meet and greets. If you want to see the facility or the facility, but the home first, you can. Sometimes the life sharing homes also do respite. So if you want to try like a weekend before kind of committing to moving in for, you know, indefinitely, that is also an option as well. So it's not like you would just have to add life sharing, individual goes into the home and that's that. So we always want to make sure that there's a smooth transition there. And then I guess also too, can you give us an example of some life sharing providers? There are a bunch. I wouldn't be able to kind of name all of them off the top of my head. However, when Miranda and I were at the Regional Collaborative Summit, we kind of talked about maybe doing like a provider fair of sorts where, you know, different providers can be invited and, you know, we can invite anyone who wants to attend basically to meet these providers and they can kind of give you guys more information about what they offer because some providers do life sharing, other providers do other types of residential services or even other non-residential services. So I don't want to give you names without being able to provide all of them because there are so many. However, you know, conversations with your supports coordinator as well could be an option, but I know we want to kind of set up maybe a provider fair and kind of get different providers in the same room and then families can meet them. I think that could be, you know, really valuable experience if anyone's open to it. So that's a work in progress. I think life sharing might be a 2-slider too.
Let's see. Yep.
Okay. So life sharing, just towards the tail end of things here. So when it comes to the rate of funding, when it comes through life sharing, it can be supported through a CLW, which is a community living waiver, and also a consolidated waiver. Unfortunately, the PFDS does not have that large budget in order to support residential services. And I guess another thing too, that in addition to the medically complex life sharing initiative, there is also another state initiative for life sharing and supported living. So that's kind of getting individuals who are currently in group home placement to kind of transition them out into life sharing or supported living. It has to be through the same agency provider, but it's just kind of, you know, kind of getting people out of, you know, that restrictive or most restrictive setting and getting them into like more community integration. And, you know, there is a lot of flexibility associated with that if the transition doesn't work out. So that's also something that the state has recently shared with us. So figured we can kind of discuss life sharing a little bit more. And like I said, we can also have a standalone life sharing presentation. It seems like there's a lot of questions here, so might have to plan that sooner rather than later.
Okay, so residential habilitation. So this residential habilitation, you will hear it called a lot of things. So you might hear it called group homes. You might hear it called CLAs, which is community living arrangements. But the actual official service title is residential habilitation. So this is a service in a licensed or unlicensed home operated by a provider agency. Almost all of the residential habilitation homes are licensed. They're licensed under 6400 regulations. So, you know, if you ever are bored and need something to help you fall asleep at night, you can pull up the 6400 regulations and you will know everything that a provider needs to do to support people in a CLA or community living arrangement. There are 24/7 staff available in the home. So we do definitely have homes where people have alone time where they don't necessarily need staff 24 hours a day. And that's okay too. Basically, the staff has to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to meet the person's needs. But really the staffing that is present in the home at any given time needs to ensure that the individual's needs are met. So we definitely have individuals who live in group homes that may have several hours a day of alone time. But those individuals, they could call staff at any time and that staff would have to come to the home to support them if they need it. The provider is responsible for everything on this list. So in addition to the stuff on this list, they are responsible for providing needed items in the home, for example, food, basic hygiene items, any of those, you know, household goods. The provider is responsible for furnishing the home unless the individual wants something special that's like above and beyond. The provider is responsible for ensuring that the individual can have visits with people that they want to see. They're responsible for ensuring that they're getting to community activities that they want to participate in. So really the individual has a lot of rights. It's their home, and the provider has to ensure that all of their needs are met. Providers do collect room and board payments from the individual. So that is based on the max SSI rate. If somebody does not get the max SSI for some reason, then it's 72% of whatever they do get. But all individuals do pay room and board. All living options must be explored and considered prior to seeking residential habilitation. So basically, group homes are kind of the last resort for living arrangements. And that's for a lot of reasons. It is considered to be the most restrictive residential option that we have within our system. So, you know, we just want to make sure that people are not being unnecessarily placed in a restrictive setting if their needs can be met in a less restrictive setting. Other supports may be reflected in the daily rate in order to support the individual with their needs. So residential habilitation, it is considered a bundled service, which means that certain things like behavioral supports, nursing, some therapies, different things like that are all included in that residential service rate. So they can't get separate services authorized. So I know we were talking about nursing within life sharing. It's kind of the same thing with the residential habilitation. If a person needs nursing, it's the residential habilitation provider's responsibility to provide that nursing service. So there is some opportunity for the provider to work with the state and get a special rate for that, because we all know nursing is expensive and nurses are hard to get. So, you know, you want to be competitive. So there is some opportunity for the provider to work with the state to get a special rate if somebody's needs are very extensive, as far as, you know, medical or behavioral needs, but it is all included in that one residential habilitation service. And the daily rate is determined by the needs group, which is a result of the SIS assessment. So any of you who are on here who already have a family member who's enrolled in a waiver. You know that you've participated in this assessment. It's that long assessment. It happens typically every 5 years, and it results in a needs group. And depending on what the individual's needs group is, and how many people live in the group home with the individual, determines what the daily rate is for that residential habilitation service.
So,
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if there's any specific questions about residential
Yeah.
habilitation before we move on to this slide.
let's say they'll probably come. People might be typing away, so we'll come back. So when it comes to residential services through ODP, there aren't, all these, endless options, but, enough, where you can support individuals depending on, there's a wide spectrum of needs. There's a question here, do consumers need to be waiver participants in order to live in, if you're referencing specifically like residential habilitation? Yes. Yeah, so they have to have a waiver, specifically a consolidated waiver, in order to fund a group home placement, only because the rates tend to be very high. So they need to have no waiver with the cap would be able to support that. So the waiver will pay specifically for that daily rate. However, the individual would also be in addition to the daily rate, which the individual is responsible for. So waiver pays for the daily rate, individual also still has to pay room and board. So I hope that answers your question.
I think it's helpful too to understand, we like to tell people this, because I think we tell people this, mostly like colleagues who work in other departments, because people will look to us and say, well, you guys have housing options. And, I think it's important to understand that residential habilitation is not housing, it's a service. So essentially what the individual is receiving through their waiver is that 24-hour-a-day service, that all-encompassing service that is required to provide the support and supervision to meet all of their health and safety needs, as well as, ensuring that they're living a meaningful and fulfilling life. So that room and board payment is to essentially cover a portion of the room and board, and really, the amount that they pay to the residential provider still doesn't cover the full room and board amount that a typical individual would, really pay for room and board. So it is somewhat subsidized as far as the room and board payments, but the waiver is paying for the service, not necessarily the house. The house is a component of the service.
So any questions, please put them in the chat. Obviously, we want to make sure, you guys, your voices are heard and that we can, provide the answers that you need. So just like backtracking a little bit when it comes to important information, we went through all the ODP residential options. It's not that there's an endless amount, but, we want to make sure that individuals are properly served. And also these services are made, they're not just necessarily one model fits all. Needs are always going to change for individuals. When it comes to residential services, the individual's health and safety is always going to be top priority. That comes even when you're seeking for placement. In what setting would the individual be the safest? But also giving them the opportunity to live an independent life, as whatever that means to them. Like we mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, level of care is an important factor when determining what kind of support is needed. So we want to make sure that individuals are receiving the appropriate care, nothing that's too restrictive, but also something that would put them at risk. And, when it comes to getting to know the individual, we want to make sure that the ISP is as accurate and updated as possible, because when you're submitting referrals for residential services, the provider is going to go off what is on the ISP. So if the ISP is not updated or does not have the most accurate information, the providers, won't know how to accurately support that individual. So that would kind of, be part of that transition process. And also too, when it comes to future planning, have these conversations with your supports coordinator. Your supports coordinator should be reviewing residential services at least annually, during the annual ISP meeting. And also to try to discover what the most least restrictive setting, is going to look like for your loved one. We never want to just jump to a group home setting because like Miranda mentioned before, it is considered the most restrictive setting within our system. So that's all, something to consider. If it's not going to be the most appropriate option, maybe we should discover other options. If the individual is capable of living independently, that's something to, consider as well. I guess a couple questions. Can you possibly speak to microboards in Pennsylvania? I'm not familiar with what microboards are. Miranda, are you?
I am. So,
Okay.
the thing about microboards, Marilyn, is that PA has now made the requirements for qualification for residential habilitation providers the same across the board. So if a family or an individual or a group wants to start a microboard, basically the process for starting up a group home through a microboard is the same as starting a group home for any other organization. So really any organization can go through the qualification process. If they meet the qualification requirements, they can become a residential habilitation provider. The requirements have gotten a little bit stricter over the past several years, and there's some more changes coming down the pike also as far as what will be required to become a residential habilitation provider. So if anybody is interested in learning more about how that works, you can reach out to your county's provider qualification lead. So in Lehigh County, that's Danielle Staley, Emily Hoosier, PQ lead in Northampton.
It's Patty.
Patty, okay.
Okay.
So yeah, so in Northampton County, you can reach out to Patty Creel. In Lehigh County, you can reach out to Danielle Staley, and they can, send you all of the info that you need on provider orientation, provider qualification. It is quite a process, but it is something that, if you feel really strongly about supporting your loved one. And basically what a microboard is, for those of you who maybe have not heard the term before, it's essentially if a family or, a group of people who are natural supports in a person's life want to start a licensed group home for a specific individual. So they would basically form this micro board, which would have a board of directors, and they would go through a process to get the home specifically qualified for that individual. But the state basically changed the process. So now everybody just has to go through the same qualification process.
One question that's on here: how does a client get a consolidated waiver if they have a home community-based waiver? So waivers are, especially consolidated waiver, I do want to preface, are not that easy to come by. I know when we're discussing these options, we're going through what is needed in order to receive certain services. Specifically, a consolidated waiver is probably needed for the residential options that we've discussed today. So basically you'd have to be placed on in the emergency wait list with your supports coordinator, that would be your PUNS, and discuss why there's a need for that. Because we do want to preface that supports aren't necessarily based on a want, but needs. So we want to make sure that the individual's health and safety is prioritized. And if there's a need for additional supports in order to maintain safety, then, obviously the emergency placement on the wait list is appropriate. I do want to preface that the wait list is not necessarily linear either. So it's based on needs. So what that means is that you could, be added onto the list and be the top priority if a waiver is available. However, if someone else comes along and their needs are more significant or more severe and that waiver is available, it's going to go to that number one slot. There's not a lot of turnover when it comes to waivers. Normally, consolidated waivers become available if an individual passes, if they go into, detention, or if they go into a long-term care facility, long-term, if that's their permanent placement. So that's kind of how consolidated waivers become available. It's not necessarily that the state provides us with these waivers. So unfortunately, it's not the easiest process. But I would always, recommend having those continuous conversations with your supports coordinator about why the supports are needed, why additional funding is needed. Because, in our experience, the SCOs do have standing meetings with us at the administrative entities to kind of discuss what's going on, who's in need. And, each county has, a waiver capacity lead who kind of, assesses what waivers are available and who they would be going to. So that's always a continuous conversation. Unfortunately, that's not just one clear answer.
And I had dropped Danielle's email in the chat, if anybody wants to talk about becoming a qualified provider for CLAs, group homes. So Emily, if you want to drop Patty's in the chat also for anybody in Northampton County.
I'm on it now.
Thanks. All right, so this just talks a little bit about parent and family participation. Family members are always a crucial part of a team. So we have a lot of people that ask about power of attorney or guardianship. This is, something that a lot of families do want to explore, and that is, definitely a personal choice. We always recommend people to consult an attorney if it's something that you're considering. However, please know that even if you're not a guardian or power of attorney, that the family's input is always valuable and a really integral part of the team. As far as financial options, people can get a third-party rep payee. So, we have a lot of individuals that maybe don't have family members that can be their rep payee for whatever reason, either because they have no family or, maybe the family just cannot fulfill that duty. There are third-party rep payees available. Some of our residential provider agencies will act as a rep payee for an individual if needed. If that's not an option, then there are some other agencies that will perform those duties. Families should be mindful of the following. The individual's choice will always be heard. They have a say in their support. So sometimes there will be some power struggles between families and individuals where, especially if an individual is already living in a residential setting, that's their home and they have rights. So we've seen a lot of situations where, individuals maybe don't want to eat super healthy and the family, doesn't want them to eat junk food, and they'll tell the provider not to buy junk food. But if the individual's, at the grocery store and they're picking up junk food, then that's their right as an adult to be able to eat what they want to eat. So it is important to keep in mind that there are a lot of regulations surrounding, the residential services, and that individuals' choices will be heard and that they do have rights. And that kind of goes to the next thing, that the way a family home is run or operated is different than a provider run home. The family member can't dictate every task in a residential placement. So it's just really important to keep those things in mind, that sometimes we have families that wonder why their individual is allowed to do certain things or make certain choices. And a lot of this just goes back to, regulations and the dignity of risk, that, individuals have choice and control in their life. They're allowed to take risks. They're adults. They can make their own choices. And sometimes, it's hard for families to remember that, but it's really important to keep that in mind when considering residential placements.
So we want to make sure we kind of address the entire lifespan and future planning. So obviously support needs are going to change as an individual ages. Things might look different from when they're in their 30s to when they might be reaching their 60s. So ODP can support an individual up until death, as long as, the services within that umbrella can meet their needs. There may be times where, medical medical needs might be beyond the nursing service that can be provided through skilled nursing. So maybe a nursing facility might be needed. Obviously, we always want to prevent that, but as an individual ages, we always have to be assessing their needs in order to keep them as safe as possible. One of the resources we wanted to share was the Pennsylvania Area on Aging. So they support individuals 60 and plus. So they are, also an option when it comes to resources. I know Northampton County, each county has like their own area division for aging. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as, an individual kind of ages and goes through the lifespan. Another key resource that we wanted to share is the PA Family Network. So they host trainings and workshops for individuals and their families for additional assistance with planning. I know they recently released their fall 2023 workshops. So you might want to check out their website. They're a valuable resource. They're kind of like made by individuals and their advocates for individuals and their advocates. So they're very familiar with, the system here through ODP, and, they're always willing to help. So they're pretty great over there. Another great resource that we want to share is the Arc of Lehigh and Northampton counties. They host a lot of events through their advocacy department. So there's going to be a link directly there to their events. So kind of take what serves you. And then they also have information when it comes to the differences between guardianship and power of attorney. So what each role looks like, that might be something worth exploring for your family if it's applicable. So want to make sure that you guys have resources available. I know we shared a lot of information today, but if anyone ever has any suggestions or want to hear more about a specific topic, you're always welcome to reach out to us to let us know. So I guess I'll wrap us up here too. So contact us if you guys have questions, but also, use your supports coordinator as a resource, and your team members. They're going to be the ones who are going to be in contact with you the most often. So kind of build that relationship with your supports coordinator, let them know of what your concerns are or what kind of options you would like to explore, or questions that you may have. So they're going to be a good resource, as life goes on. But also reach out to us with questions, or if you guys have any specific topics that you would like us to review. Miranda's contact information's on there, and so is mine. For any Lehigh individuals specifically, please go to Miranda. And for any Northampton County individuals, you can reach out to me. I guess before we sign off, I know we're a little bit over time, but any last minute questions, please share them. We can stay on for a couple more minutes, but if not, if you are ready to sign off, that's okay too. So either way, I just want to say thanks everyone for coming. Okay. Oh, and then Susan from the ARC. So she's part of the advocacy department there. She's wonderful. So apparently they also have a YouTube channel as well. So they'll have a video on power of attorney and guardianship. So if you don't want to read it, you can watch it. Other than that, if you guys don't have any questions, you're free to sign off. If anyone does have questions, feel free to unmute yourself. No? Okay. I'll take.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Okay.
lot, everybody. Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye. Hey, when's our next meeting?
Hold on one second.
Actually, I should
Let me figure out how I can stop recording, and then
And we can answer that. Okay, thank you.